Welcome to Unlocking Passion. Men Report. Let's begin with a new story. Brian Thompson stood in front of an empty concrete shell on Soi Buakaw and stared at the rusted padlock on the door, where only 72 hours earlier his dream had still existed. The bar he had bought for €198,000, the business he believed would secure his future with the woman he loved, had now been stripped to the walls, sold off piece by piece, while Somruti disappeared into Thailand's neon chaos with another man's promises in her ear and Brian's life savings in her bank account. He was 58 years old, standing in the late afternoon heat of Pattaya, unable to understand how everything had gone so catastrophically wrong. Only 3 months earlier, Brian had been sitting in his small apartment in Seattle, Washington, planning his retirement with a kind of excitement he had not felt in decades. For years he had sold restaurant equipment, industrial ovens, refrigeration units, and stainless steel counters to restaurants, hotels, and catering companies across the Pacific Northwest. It was steady work, reliable income, but it had never been glamorous or especially fulfilling. It was simply what he did. His marriage had ended 4 years earlier. There had been no drama, no infidelity, only a slow erosion of connection, until one day his wife told him she wanted something different. They sold the house, divided the assets, and went their separate ways. Brian moved into a 1-bedroom apartment near Green Lake, kept working, and told himself he was fine. But he was not fine. He was lonely in a way that felt permanent, as if he had missed some crucial window in life. When his company was acquired by a larger competitor at the beginning of 2023, Brian was offered a severance package. It was not a fortune, but it was enough, €315,000 after taxes. He was tired and ready to stop pretending that his life in Seattle still had any meaning. He had no children, no romantic prospects, and no real reason to stay. So he began researching places where he could retire early, live comfortably, and maybe, just maybe, find something that felt like happiness. Thailand kept appearing in his searches. The cost of living was low, the weather was warm, and there was a whole community of Western retirees who had made the move and never looked back. Pattaya in particular seemed to offer everything he was looking for: beachfront living, affordable rent, good food, and a nightlife that promised companionship without judgment. Brian was not naive. He knew what Pattaya was known for, but he also knew he was tired of feeling invisible, tired of going to bed alone every night, tired of feeling as if his life was already over even though he was still breathing. In June 2023, Brian booked a one-way ticket to Bangkok and began what he hoped would be the last chapter of his life, one defined not by routine and regret, but by adventure, connection, and the simple pleasure of waking up each day in a place that felt alive. He arrived on a humid evening at Suvarnabhumi Airport, the kind of heat that clings to the skin and makes every breath feel heavy. He took a taxi to Pattaya and watched as the highway stretched out ahead of him and the city lights grew brighter as they approached. He had rented a small studio apartment in Jomtien, south of the main tourist area, in a building mostly occupied by long-term foreign residents. The rent was 12,000 baht a month, less than €360, and the apartment was basic but clean, with a balcony overlooking the street below. In the first weeks, Brian spent his days exploring the city, walking along Beach Road, eating street food, and trying to adjust to the overwhelming sensory experience of Pattaya. It was louder, dirtier, and more chaotic than he had imagined, but it was also intoxicating. There was energy here, a feeling that anything could happen at any moment. People smiled at him, greeted him, asked where he was from. He had not felt so noticed in years. At night he walked along Walking Street, or wandered through the smaller swa that branched into neighborhoods full of bars, restaurants, and clusters of motorbikes parked haphazardly on the sidewalk. He was not looking for anything specific, only trying to understand the rhythm of the place, its unspoken rules, the way life worked here. It was during one of those walks, about 3 weeks after his arrival, that Brian first stepped into a small beer bar on Soi Bukkao called Lucky Star. The bar was nothing special, a narrow open-air space with a wooden counter, a few high stools and a row of beer coolers along the back wall. 4 or 5 girls worked there, dressed in shorts and tank tops, chatting with a handful of older Western men who sat drinking and watching sports on a small television in the corner. Brian sat at the bar and ordered a Leo beer. One of the girls brought it over, opened it, and placed it in front of him with a smile. Her name tag said Mai. She was petite, with shoulder-length black hair and a face that was more sweet than beautiful, round cheeks, bright eyes, and a smile that seemed genuine rather than performed. She asked him the usual questions. Where are you from? How long have you been in Thailand? Do you like Pattaya? Brian answered politely, and she lingered, leaning against the bar and laughing at his jokes in a way that actually made him feel funny. He stayed for 2 beers, then 3. May kept coming back to talk to him, even though there were other customers in the bar. She told him she was from Buram, a province in northeastern Thailand, and that she had been working in Pattaya for 6 years. She said she did not really like the work, but it paid better than anything she could find back home. Brian liked the way she spoke, direct, unfiltered, without the exaggerated sweetness some of the other girls seemed to adopt. She felt real. When he finally paid his bill and stood up to leave, May lightly touched his arm and said, "You come back tomorrow, okay? I want to see you again." Brian came back the next day and the day after that. Within a week, he was visiting Lucky Star almost every evening, always sitting in the same seat at the bar, always talking to May. She began remembering details about him, what he liked to drink, where he had eaten lunch, the stories he told about his life in Seattle. She started calling him "my heart," a term of endearment that made him feel both ridiculous and deeply wanted. It did not take long for their interactions to move beyond the bar. May began sending him messages during the day asking how he was, what he was doing, sending photos of her lunch or a funny meme she had found online. She invited him to take her out to dinner on her night off, and they went to a small Thai restaurant by the beach where she ordered for both of them and laughed at his attempts to use chopsticks. After dinner, they walked along the beach, and she took his hand without asking. Brian felt something shift inside him, a warmth, a sense of possibility he had not felt in years. By the end of his 2nd month in Pattaya, Brian and May were spending every free moment together. She stayed at his apartment several nights a week, and they began talking about the future the way new couples do, half joking, half serious, testing the boundaries of what might be possible. May told him she hated working in the bar, that she only did it because she had no other choice. She said her mother was sick and living in a village in Buriram, and that she sent money home every month to help pay for medical care. She said she dreamed of leaving the bar, owning her own business, and living a normal life. Brian believed her. He wanted to believe her. When she looked at him with those bright, hopeful eyes and called him "my heart," he felt as if he had finally found the purpose his life had been missing. It was at the beginning of September, a little more than 2 months after Brian had first walked into Lucky Star, that May first mentioned the idea of owning her own bar. They were lying in bed in his apartment. The fan turned lazily above them. The sounds of motorcycles and street vendors drifted up from the road below. May was scrolling through her phone and suddenly turned to him with an expression that was half excitement and half hesitation. "Bree," she said, using the nickname she had given him. "I have idea." "You want here?" Brian propped himself up on one elbow and smiled. "Of course." "What is it?" May sat up, crossed her legs beneath her, and her eyes lit up with excitement. She told him she did not like working at Lucky Star. Every night was the same. Old men came, she smiled, she talked, she drank too much, and she felt trapped. Brian nodded. He had heard this before, and every time she said it he felt a stab of guilt, as if he were somehow complicit in her unhappiness simply by being one of the men who visited bars like hers. I want my own bar, May said. Small bar, not big. Just me and maybe 2 or 3 girls. I can be boss. I make schedule. I choose everything. Then I not need work for other people anymore. I can have good life. She paused and watched his face carefully. Then she added that she did not have the money. She had saved a little, but not enough. Maybe he could help her. Brian felt his heart beat faster. He had known this conversation was coming. He had sensed it in the way she kept talking more and more about leaving Lucky Star and wanting something better. He had even thought about it himself late at night, lying awake and imagining what it would be like to help her build something, to be the person who made her dreams come true. How much would you need? He asked carefully. May bit her lip as though embarrassed to say the number. She said she was not exactly sure. Maybe 100,000 euros, maybe a little more. Rent for the space, furniture, drinks, licenses, renovations. In Thailand, everything required money. Brian felt a knot form in his stomach. It was a large amount, but not impossible. He still had most of his severance money and had barely touched it since arriving in Thailand. He was living comfortably on less than 1,800 euros a month. If he helped May, he would still have more than enough left to support himself for years. But there was something else too, a voice in the back of his mind that sounded suspiciously like his ex-wife, warning him to be careful, to think things through, to remember that he barely knew this woman. He pushed the voice away. He was tired of being careful. He was tired of living a life defined by caution and fear. Let me think about it, he said at last. I want to help you, May. Her face brightened, but she nodded. She told him it was a big decision and that she understood. Then she kissed him on the cheek, lay back down, and curled against his side. Brian stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He imagined walking into a bar they had built together, seeing May behind the counter, happy and free. He imagined the pride he would feel, the sense of fulfillment, her gratitude, her love, the way she would look at him knowing he had changed her life. By the time he fell asleep, he had already made his decision. If you are fascinated by this story and want to see more true crime and romance scam documentaries exposing the dark side of romantic fraud, be sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. These stories need to be told, and your support helps us continue researching and sharing the truth. Stay with us. Brian's story is only beginning, and what happens next will shock you. Within a week, Brian had transferred 112,000 euros to May's Thai bank account. The amount was higher than her original estimate because, as she explained, the costs were more complicated than she had first thought. The security deposit on the property was higher. The renovation would cost more because the space needed electrical work. The liquor license required additional fees. Brian did not question any of it. He trusted her. She had shown him listings for potential properties, had taken him to see several empty business spaces on Soi Buhao, and had pointed excitedly to where the bar would go, where the seating area would be, how she would arrange the lights and the sound system. She had found what she called the perfect space, a narrow 2-story building between a massage shop and a small restaurant. The ground floor would be the bar, and the upper floor could be turned into a small apartment where May could live. It was in a busy area with heavy foot traffic, and May said she had already spoken with the landlady, a middle-aged Thai woman who owned several properties in the area. The rent was high, and the lease would run for 3 years. Brian went with May to sign the lease. The landlady barely looked at him, speaking only to May in rapid Thai and occasionally glancing at the stack of cash May had brought in a plastic bag. Brian did not understand what was being said, but May translated fragments for him, something about the deposit, the lease terms, the rules about noise and closing times. At the end of the meeting, the landlady handed the contract to May, and they shook hands. Brian noticed that his name appeared nowhere on the paperwork. When he asked about it later, May said that was normal. Foreigners could not own businesses in Thailand, she explained. Everything had to be in her name. That was the law. Brian accepted this. He had read enough about Thai business regulations to know that foreign ownership was complicated and often impossible. He told himself it did not matter whose name was on the paper. This was her project. They were building it together. The renovation took 6 weeks. May hired a crew of Thai workers who arrived early each morning with tools, ladders, and bags of cement. Brian visited the site almost every day and watched the space transform. The walls were repainted dark red and black, giving the bar a moody, intimate atmosphere. A long wooden counter was installed along one side with shelves for bottles behind it. High tables and stools were arranged near the entrance, and a small stage area was built in the back corner for a DJ or live music. May insisted on installing high-quality sound equipment, speakers, amplifiers, and a mixing board, because, she said, music was the most important part of any bar in Pattaya. Brian paid for everything. Every invoice, every receipt, every unexpected expense. The electrical work cost more than expected. The liquor license required an additional payment to speed up the process. The furniture supplier demanded cash in advance. The workers had to be paid weekly. Brian watched his bank account shrink with every transaction, but he told himself it was an investment. He was building something real. He was building a future with May. By the middle of November, the bar was finished. May had named it Dream Bar, and she had ordered a custom neon sign that glowed in bright pink and blue above the entrance. She hired 3 girls to work with her, young women from Isan who had worked in other bars and knew how to deal with customers. She filled the coolers with beer, stocked the shelves with whiskey and vodka, and set up a small kitchen area where simple snacks could be prepared: fried rice, spring rolls, chicken skewers. The grand opening was scheduled for the last Friday in November. May printed flyers and distributed them around Soi Buchau, and she invited some of her friends from Lucky Star to come for free drinks. Brian felt a surge of pride as he stood outside Dream Bar on opening night, watching people stream inside while the music blasted out onto the street. May stood behind the bar glowing, laughing, serving drinks with the confidence of someone who had finally found her place in the world. Brian sat at one of the high tables near the entrance, sipping a beer and watching her. She caught his eye and blew him a kiss. In that moment, he felt like the happiest man in Pattaya. For the first 2 weeks, the bar seemed to do well. It was busy most evenings with a steady flow of customers: older Western men, a few younger backpackers, groups of Thai locals who came for the cheap drinks and loud music. May worked hard, stayed behind the counter until closing, managed the staff, and kept the energy high. Brian helped where he could, mostly by sitting in the bar and being a friendly face, occasionally paying a bill for a customer who seemed short on cash. But he also began to notice small changes in May's behavior. She often seemed tired and snapped at him when he asked about the finances or how much money the bar was making. She said she was too busy to talk about it, that he did not understand how stressful it was to run a business. When he asked to see the books, the daily sales records, the expenses, the profit margins, she became defensive. "You not trust me?" she would say sharply. "You think I steal from you?" Brian always backed down. He did not want to fight. He did not want to seem controlling or suspicious. He told himself she was under a lot of pressure, that she was doing her best, that he just needed to be patient. By the middle of December, Brian had invested a total of €198,000 into Dream Bar. The number shocked him when he finally sat down one afternoon in his apartment and calculated it from his bank statements and receipts. He had told himself it would be 100,000, maybe 120, but the costs kept rising: more inventory, repairs to the sound system, a deposit for a new license, staff salaries. May always had a reason, always an explanation, and Brian had always said yes. He still had enough money to live on, but the cushion he had once felt was gone. He was no longer comfortable. He was committed. It was at the end of December that Brian first felt the cold edge of doubt creeping into his mind. He had been in Dream Bar almost every night since the opening, sitting in his usual place near the entrance, watching May work, chatting with customers, playing the role of the supportive partner. But he had started to notice things that did not add up. The bar was busy, often packed with customers, yet May always seemed stressed about money. She told him they were barely breaking even, that the costs were higher than expected, that they needed more cash to keep things running smoothly. He had already given her an additional 14,000 euros just 2 weeks after opening, money she said she needed to pay staff and restock the bar. He had not asked for receipts. He had not asked for proof. He had simply transferred the money. But one evening, while May was in the back room dealing with a supplier, Brian overheard a conversation between two of the bar girls. They were speaking Thai and assumed he could not understand them, but in the past few months he had picked up enough of the language to catch fragments of what they were saying. One of them mentioned a man named Somai, someone who came to the bar regularly, someone May had been spending time with. The other girl laughed and said something about how clever May was, how she always had a backup plan. Brian felt his stomach tighten. He did not confront May that night. He told himself he was being paranoid, that he had misunderstood, that the girls were only gossiping. But the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it grew quickly. A few days later, Brian did something he had never done before. He showed up at Dream Bar in the middle of the afternoon when it was normally closed. He had told May he was going to Bangkok for the day to renew his visa, but instead he took a motorbike taxi to Soi Buhao and quietly walked down the street toward the bar. As he approached, he saw that the metal shutters were half open and could hear voices inside. He peered through the gap. May was sitting at one of the tables with a Thai man Brian had never seen before. The man looked to be in his 40s, well-dressed, and had a leather briefcase open on the table in front of him. May was laughing, leaning close to him, her hand resting on his arm. They were speaking Thai too quickly for Brian to follow, but the tone was familiar, intimate, flirtatious. Brian felt a rush of rage and heartbreak. He shoved the shutter open and stepped inside. May looked up, her face going pale. The man stood quickly, grabbed his briefcase, said something to her in Thai, and hurried out through the back door. "Bree," May said tensely. "What you doing here? You said you go Bangkok." "Who was that?" Brian asked, his voice trembling. "Just friend. He helped me with business." "Why? You come here spying on me?" "I'm not spying. I wanted to see you. But now I want to know what the hell is going on." May's expression hardened. "Nothing going on. You crazy. You jealous. This my bar. I can talk to whoever I want." Brian stared at her, searching her face for the warmth he had once seen there, but it was gone. She looked at him now with something close to contempt, as if he were an inconvenience, an obstacle. "I want to see the books," Brian said quietly. "I want to see where the money is going." May laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "You want see books? You think you my boss? This my bar, Bree. You give me money. Yes, you help me. But this not your business. It mine. I've given you 198,000 euros, Brian said, his voice rising. I think that makes it my business." May's eyes flashed with anger. "You give me money because you want me love you, because you want feel like big man. Now you complain. Now you want control me. You same like all Farang. You think you can buy me." The words hit Brian like a physical blow. He stood there speechless as May grabbed her handbag and headed for the door. "I go now," she said. "You stay here if you want. Think about what you say." She left, and Brian stood alone in the empty bar, surrounded by neon lights, polished wood, and all the expensive equipment he had paid for. He felt hollow, as if someone had reached inside him and scooped out everything that had once made him feel alive. Brian did not see May for 3 days after that confrontation. She did not answer his calls or reply to his messages. The bar stayed closed, the shutters pulled down, the neon sign dark. Brian walked past it several times, hoping to see some sign of life, but there was nothing. On the 4th day, one of the bar girls, a young woman named Nok, contacted him through Facebook Messenger. She said she needed to speak with him, that it was important. They agreed to meet at a cafe near Jomtien Beach. Nok looked nervous when she arrived. She kept glancing over her shoulder as though afraid of being seen. She ordered a coffee but did not drink it. She sat with her hands wrapped around the cup, staring at the table. "I need tell you something," she finally said. "About May." Brian leaned forward. "What is it?" "May not who you think. She have other boyfriend. Thai man. His name Somai. He come dream bar many times. They together, long time before she meet you. May tell him, you give her money for bar, and they make plan. They sell equipment, sell furniture, take money and go." Brian felt as if the room tilted beneath him. "What are you talking about?" Nok looked up at him, her eyes full of pity. She said she was sorry. She liked him. He was a good man, but May was not a good woman. She had done this before. In another place she had run the same scam. Other foreign men had given her money. She took everything and disappeared. That was what she did. She was very good at it. Brian's mind reeled. He asked where she was now. Nok said she did not know. Maybe Phuket, maybe Bangkok. May had told her she was leaving and not coming back. She said the bar was finished. Everything was in May's name, Nok said. Brian could do nothing. The police would not help a foreigner with something like this. This was Thailand. Brian leaned back in his chair, stared at the ceiling, and tried to process what he was hearing. He had been a fool. He had been so desperate to believe in something, in love, in connection, in the fantasy of saving a woman and building a life together, that he had ignored every red flag, every warning sign, every moment when his gut told him something was wrong. He thanked Nok, paid for the coffee, and walked back to his apartment in a haze. When he got home, he called his bank and checked his balance. He had 56,000 euros left. It was enough to survive for a while, but not enough to start over. Not enough to go home. Not enough to undo the damage. That evening, Brian took a motorbike taxi back to Soi Buakau. He stood in front of Dream Bar and stared at the locked entrance, the pink and blue neon sign now lifeless. He tried the door, but it was locked. He looked through the gaps in the shutters, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The bar was empty. Completely empty. The counter was gone. The tables and stools were gone. The sound equipment, the shelves, the coolers, everything had been ripped out. The walls were bare, the floor covered in dust and debris. It looked as if the place had been abandoned for years. Brian stood there for a long time, unable to move, unable to think. He had bought that bar. He had paid for every piece of it. And now it was gone, as if it had never existed. The next morning, Brian went to the police. He brought his bank statements, his receipts, and screenshots of his conversations with May. He sat in a cramped office at the Pattaya police station across from a bored-looking officer who barely glanced at the documents spread across the desk. "This civil matter," the officer said in broken English. "Not criminal. You give money to girlfriend. She use money. You cannot prove. Everything in her name. You sign nothing. You have no claim." "But she lied to me," Brian said desperately. "She took my money and disappeared. She sold everything. Doesn't that count as fraud?" The officer shrugged. "Maybe. But hard to prove. You need lawyer. You need go to court. Take long time. Cost much money. Maybe you lose. Brian left the police station defeated. He knew the officer was right. He had no legal standing. He had given May the money voluntarily. He had signed nothing. He had no proof of ownership, no contract, no written agreement. In the eyes of the law, he was simply a foreigner who had made a bad decision. In the following weeks, Brian tried to find out what had happened. He learned from other expats in Pattaya that May's real name was Somruti Kemsing, and that she had a long history of deceiving foreign men. She had done this at least 3 times before, convincing men to invest in businesses and then vanishing with the money. She was known in certain circles, whispered about in bars and online forums, but no one had ever been able to prove anything or take her to court. Brian also learned that the man he had seen with May in the bar, Somai, was her longtime boyfriend, possibly even her husband. They worked together, running the same scam over and over again and targeting lonely older men desperate for connection. They were good at it. They knew exactly what to say, how to build trust, how to exploit vulnerability. Brian felt humiliated. He felt stupid. He felt as though he had been reduced to a cliché, the naive foreigner who falls for the beautiful Thai woman and loses everything. He had become the punchline of a joke he once thought he was too smart to fall for. His money was gone. His dream was gone. Worst of all, his sense of self-worth was gone. He no longer knew who he was or what he was doing in Thailand. He had come here looking for a fresh start and instead had walked straight into a trap. By January 2024, Brian had moved out of his studio apartment in Jomtien. He could no longer afford the rent. He found a cheaper place in a rundown building near a lower-budget neighborhood where long-term expats on tight finances tended to live. The new apartment cost 7,000 baht a month, just over €200, and it was small, dark, and smelled faintly of mold, but it was all he could afford. He still had about €50,000 left in his bank account, but he was terrified it would run out. He began cutting costs wherever he could. He stopped eating in restaurants and started buying food from street vendors. He stopped taking taxis and began walking everywhere. He stopped going to bars entirely, unable to bear the sight of neon lights, laughter, and girls who reminded him of May. Brian also started looking for work. He was 58 years old, living in a foreign country on a tourist visa, and had no legal right to work in Thailand. But he needed money, and he needed something to occupy his mind before guilt and shame consumed him completely. Through a mutual acquaintance, he met an older British expat named Roger who owned a small guest house in Jomtien. Roger was in his 70s, struggled with arthritis, and needed someone to help manage the property, check guests in and out, handle maintenance requests, and keep the place running. He offered Brian a part-time job paying 15,000 baht a month, about €400. It was not much, but it was something. Brian took the job. He worked 6 days a week, arriving at the guest house early in the morning and leaving around 6 in the evening. The work was monotonous and exhausting, but it gave him a routine, a sense of purpose. Roger was kind to him and never asked too many questions about how Brian had ended up in this situation. He seemed to understand that Pattaya was full of men like Brian, men who had come searching for something better and found only loss. At night, Brian returned to his apartment, ate a simple meal, and lay on his bed staring at the ceiling. He thought often about May, about the way she had looked at him in the early days, the way she had called him "my heart." He wondered whether any of it had been real. He wondered whether she had ever felt anything for him at all, or whether he had simply been a victim, a walking ATM with a desperate need to be loved. He also thought about his life in Seattle, the life he had been so eager to leave behind. He thought about his ex-wife, his old job, his old apartment. It had not been exciting, but it had been stable. It had been safe. He had thrown all of that away for a fantasy, and now he was paying the price. In March 2024, Brian received a message on Facebook from a man named David, an Australian who had also been scammed by May. David had seen Brian's posts in an expat forum, where Brian had shared his story as a warning to others. David said he had lost €90,000 to May 2 years earlier by investing in a restaurant that had also been stripped and abandoned. They agreed to meet for coffee in a small cafe in Pattaya. David was in his early 60s, gray-haired and exhausted looking, and he told Brian a story that was disturbingly similar to his own. May had worked in a bar. She had been sweet, vulnerable, full of dreams. She had convinced David to invest in a business. Then she disappeared with the money. I tried to sue her, David said. Spent another $20,000 on lawyers. Got nowhere. The courts don't care about foreigners who make bad business decisions. I finally gave up and went back to Australia, but I came back to warn people. She's still doing it, you know. She's still out there. Brian felt a wave of anger. How does she keep getting away with it? Why doesn't anyone stop her? David shrugged. Because she's smart. She never does anything technically illegal. She gets men to give her money willingly. She never signs contracts. She never makes written promises. Everything is verbal. Everything is based on trust. And once the money is gone, no one can do anything. Someone has to stop her, Brian said. Maybe, David replied. But it won't be us. The system doesn't work like that here. The best we can do is warn other men, tell our stories, and hope somebody listens. Brian left the meeting even more defeated. He realized he would never get his money back. He would never see justice. He would simply have to live with the consequences of his decisions. By the summer of 2024, Brian had settled into his new life in Pattaya. It was not the life he had imagined when he first arrived, but it was the life he had. He kept working at Roger's guest house, saved what little money he could, and tried to rebuild some measure of stability. He had made a few friends among other long-term expats, men with similar stories and similar regrets. They met for cheap dinners, shared beers on the beach, and talked about the mistakes they had made and the lessons they had learned. There was a strange comfort in their shared brokenness, a feeling that they were all survivors of the same war. Brian also began volunteering with a small expat-run organization that helped educate newcomers about the risks of scams and romance fraud in Thailand. He gave talks at expat meetups and shared his story in the hope that it might stop someone else from making the same mistakes. It was difficult to stand in front of strangers and admit his failures, but it also felt like a form of redemption. If he could save even one person from what he had gone through, then maybe his suffering would mean something. He never heard from May again. He searched for her online from time to time, looked through social media profiles and bar worker forums, but she had completely vanished. He heard rumors that she had moved to Phuket, later to another city, always under a new name, always with a new victim. The Thai police had no interest in pursuing her. She was a ghost slipping through the system, leaving behind a trail of broken men and emptied bank accounts. Brian's rage eventually gave way to a dull acceptance. He had made his choices. He had ignored the warnings. He had believed in something that was never real. There was no one left to blame but himself. 3 years have passed since Brian Thompson stood in front of Dream Bar and watched his life collapse. He is now 61 years old and still lives in Pattaya, still works part-time at Roger's guest house. He has not returned to Seattle. He cannot afford to. His savings have shrunk to just under €27,000, enough to survive for a few more years if he remains careful, but not enough to rebuild the life he once had. He lives quietly now, without the dreams or expectations that once defined him. He has learned to be satisfied with small pleasures, a cold beer at sunset, a good meal from a street vendor, the company of friends who understand what it means to lose everything and keep going anyway. He no longer searches for love or connection. He no longer believes in fresh starts or second chances. He has accepted that this is his life now, and that it will probably remain that way until the end. When people ask him about his time in Thailand, he tells the truth. He does not soften it, and he does not make excuses. He says he came to Pattaya looking for happiness and found only loss. He says he bought a bar for a woman he loved, and she took everything and disappeared. He says he was a fool, but he was also human, and that sometimes those two things are the same. Brian still walks past the building on Soi Bukkao where Dream Bar once stood. It is rented to someone else now, a small convenience shop that sells instant noodles and bottled water. The neon sign is gone. The music is gone. There is no trace of what once existed there, no evidence of the 198,000 euros Brian poured into that room believing he was building a future. Sometimes he stands there and stares at the shop, remembering the night of the grand opening, the way May smiled at him from behind the bar, the way he felt like the happiest man in the world. It feels like a lifetime ago. It feels like someone else's memory. Brian Thompson came to Thailand looking for a simple life in paradise. What he found instead was a painful education in trust, vulnerability, and the high cost of believing in love without question. He thought he was buying a bar. He thought he was building a dream. But in the end he paid only for a fantasy, one that cost him almost everything and left him with nothing but regret and the bitter knowledge that some lessons can only be learned the hard way. He does not hate May. He does not even hate Thailand. He simply exists now, moving through his days with the quiet resignation of a man who has learned that paradise always comes with a price, and that sometimes the price is far higher than anyone could ever imagine. Brian's story is a haunting reminder that romance scams can happen to anyone, regardless of age, intelligence, or life experience. If this documentary has opened your eyes to the realities of romance fraud in Southeast Asia, please subscribe to our channel and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Your awareness could save someone from making the same devastating mistakes. Stay safe, stay informed, and remember, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is.